have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Jonathan Cohn, one of the country's leading healthcare reporters. He worked for the New Republic and then for years Huffington Post, and recently he joined the Bulwark. He also has written two very important books, very influential books on healthcare. One was Sick, the Untold Crisis of American Healthcare, back just before the Affordable Care Act. And then more recently, the 10 Years War, the unfinished crusade for universal health care, both of which I strongly recommend for people who want both current view on healthcare and also the very interesting history to go back and read those books. So thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being on the show.
So what I got to ask you about, obviously the big issue, everyone's following healthcare, at least, and even people who want have to ask about, what do we know about the state? We have the reconciliation package, obviously front and center are cuts to Medicaid. And clearly that's what the Republicans are counting on to cover a lot of the cost of their tax cut. So where does that stand now, at least as far as you know? I understand that a lot of stuff's still up in the air, but as far as you know, where does that stand?
Yeah, the big, beautiful bill, they're calling it. Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill with tax cuts and a bunch of other stuff. But the big on the spending side, the biggest part, as you said, Dean, are these cuts to Medicaid. We're recording this on Monday, following a late night vote on Sunday in the Budget Committee. That vote followed some changes to the previous version, and we're not entirely sure what those changes were yet because they just voted it through, and we can talk about the process here and what they're doing. But what we know, broadly speaking, is that at least the last version we saw, there were more than $600 billion over 10 years in cuts to Medicaid. And Dean, $600 billion, that's even in Washington, that's a lot of money. Yeah. You hear millions, billions, it can, sometimes it's a little misleading. That is a lot of money. It's a big cut. And the projection is that, again, of the previous version, subject to whatever changes have been made to it, that alone was going to cause more than 7 million people to become uninsured. And that is in addition to some cuts to the Affordable Care Act that are tucked in there, Obamacare, that would take more money out and that would add another 1 million or 2 million people uninsured. And that's then on top of, there's a whole other set of people who might lose insurance for a separate reason related to the Affordable Care Act. We can talk about that later. And we can get into the details of what the pieces of these Medicaid cuts are. But I always I always start this conversation by saying, look, before we get in the weeds here, this isn't actually that complicated. If you take hundreds of billions of dollars out of Medicaid, a program that's paying the medical bills for low-income Americans, you can do it any way you want. And Republicans have tried almost every way to do it. But at the end of the day, the road leads to the same place. You're taking a lot of money out of a program that provides low-income people with healthcare. Low-income people are going to lose healthcare. Either people are going to lose their coverage altogether, and that's mostly what happens here. Or people who hold on to their coverage are going to see it's going to do less for them. They're going to owe more in out-of-pocket costs. There's going to be services they can't access. So this is a real hit on the population that relies on Medicaid. Very serious one, and really would be the biggest cut in a government health insurance program, I think, arguably, not just in modern times, but of all times. I mean, it's really, I've been trying to think if there's a comparable example, and there really is not. There's one program in history where there was a repeal of something before it took effect, and that would have been somewhat. But even that, I think, wasn't even close.
I remember that one.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, you and I remember that one because it was a very famous political episode.
Yeah. Let me just step back for a second because I realized you corrected me. I think I inadvertently said Medicare when I obviously meant Medicaid. But just again, to amplify the point here, I think we're up to 71 million people are covered by Medicaid now.
Yeah, Yeah, and it varies every month to month, but yes, that sounds right. I haven't looked at this month's figures. And first of all, by the way, as speaking as somebody who covers healthcare all the time, I constantly, I mean, even I do, and I definitely know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. I think, like you, I've often wondered if Donald
Thanks for
Trump
making me
knew the
feel
difference.
better.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's just you're talking, and especially, I mean, there is actually overlap between the two programs, which let's
Yeah.
talk about that in a second. That your brain, if you're thinking real time, will mix them. So, yeah, more than 70 million people. The majority of those are people who are either children or working age adults who don't have another source. Typically, depending on the criteria varies from state to state a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when we're talking about the population, it's mostly children and working age adults, although group of people, there are a minority in terms of enrollment who are either elderly or people with disabilities. And this is where we get to the Medicare part. These are people who have Medicare to pay their primary medical costs. But as anybody familiar with Medicare knows firsthand, there's a lot that Medicare does not cover. It can leave you with really big out-of-pocket costs. And there are whole categories of services and care that Medicare does not cover. And the biggest, most obvious of these is long-term care. Medicare does not cover long-term care in a nursing home. It will not cover long-term care for home care. And so Medicaid does cover those things. And so you have people who are elderly or people with disabilities who have Medicare, but then also use Medicaid to fill in those gaps. And that is why, for example, the single biggest payer for nursing home care in the United States is Medicaid. And so when you talk about the impact of this program, it's easy to think, well, Medicaid, it's this program for low-income people, probably not that many people. Maybe if you're a middle-class listener, you're thinking, not me. Guess again, it's a huge part of the population. In fact, KFF, which is this resource organization out in California, it used to be called the Kaiser Family Foundation. They changed the name, I think, in part because they were tired of everybody confusing them with Kaiser Permanente Healthcare. KFF has done studies of this, and more than 2/3 of Americans personally know somebody who is or has been on Medicaid and used it to pay their bills. So this is a really important program for a incredibly large part of the population. And that's not to even talk about, its economic impact in communities where it's supporting.
Yeah, I mean, just the basic arithmetic, if you have 71 million, that's more than 1/5 of the population. So this obviously goes beyond, I mean, thankfully, we don't have 1/5 of the population in poverty. So it's not, obviously, it serves low income population, but it goes well beyond just people who think of as low income. It goes well into moderate income. And as you say, with the coverage for home health care, long-term care, you have a lot of very middle-class families that get in a situation, and either because of disability or in their retirement years, and they can't afford home health care or long-term care. It's incredibly expensive, and they basically spend down their assets. I mean, it's not a pretty story. They spend down their assets, and then they're dependent on Medicaid. So it's a really big deal. It's a safety net program that means an enormous amount for, as we said, tens of millions of people. So if I could ask you, and again, this is obviously changing, but what, as far as what's the nature of the cuts, the mechanics, and we don't have to get that much in the nitty gritty, but I think it is important because, I mean, to my view, it's very devious. Again, I suspect you feel the same, but, I think that the mechanics of where they see most of these cuts taking place, I think is worth highlighting.
Yeah. I'll give you a quick overview, and then you can tell me which parts you think we want to go deep on. There's a couple different baskets is the easiest way to think of it. So the biggest basket, single biggest one, are what are being called work requirements. And if you're familiar with this debate, it's basically you have to demonstrate that you're either employed, looking for a job, involved in some community activity, or qualify for one of several exemptions. That's the single biggest cut. It's a cut because they expect lots of people to lose insurance because of that. There's a second category, which is sort of seemingly technical changes to enrollment and eligibility procedures that sound like, we're just, being more rigorous about checking who qualifies, who doesn't, et cetera. But again, lots of people turn out to lose insurance in that. There's another category, which is a straight up asking certain people on Medicaid to pay more of their healthcare costs through out-of-pocket costs. So there's that category. There are some kind of back-end changes to the way, states put up their share of the money. Again, it's a joint federal-state program. The federal government pays the majority of funds, but states do contribute. It's a very complicated financial relationship, and states have come up with a bunch of different ways to manage their share. There's some changes in this bill that would prohibit some of the arrangements they're using. We'll talk about why that is. And then there's a final basket, which is sort of this sort of culture, kind of dovetailing what they want to do with Medicaid with various other items on their agenda. So defunding of abortion providers, an attempt to sort of make it harder for states to use some of their own money to cover undocumented immigrants, ban on Medicaid money going into gender affirming care, things like that.
With the work requirements, I mean, this is one that, they often tout, and it's, again, I'm sure you've gone through it more closely than I have, but I mean, there've already been experiments. This is just one of the things that's frustrating. First of all, the vast majority of people who are, capable of working, obviously people with disabilities aren't capable, or severe disabilities, I should say, aren't capable of working, but people are capable of working. The overwhelming majority, I forget what the exact number is, we're talking 75, 80%, they are working. And you've had states that have experimented with work requirements, and almost invariably, now there may be an exception, but there's studies I've seen, again, maybe some study shows a different conclusion. It doesn't increase work it doesn't increase work. So what you find is it does reduce the number of people that get Medicaid, but it's because of, they don't fill out the right forms, and they're harassed by it. And, I'm an economist. I know, it's always dangerous to rely on anecdotal evidence, but I'm going to use some anecdotal evidence. My mother for years worked for the Illinois Department of Public Aid. So she was the person. She was seeing people coming in, applying for aid. And every now and then we'd have a politician get elected governor, and he said, I'm going to crack down on all the fraud. And, they'd have some new requirements for people to get, public aid. And her assessment, and I trust my mother, her assessment, she's not a bleeding heart liberal, I mean, but, her assessment was that almost invariably there'd be people she would be pretty confident were frauds, that they didn't actually need it. And, so it's not 100%, not everyone on the program needed it. There are people who she felt, but they followed the rules. So they knew what you had to do, and whatever was put in place, additional requirement, hoops you had to jump through, they would do that because they were on top of it. The people who wouldn't do that were people who felt guilty about being on aid to begin with. And when you ask them for additional paperwork, they'd go, well, okay. And they'd lose their benefits. She would try to make sure they do it. But, she was, I think, very conscientious, probably more so than most. But even then, she'd have some people that wouldn't fill out the right forms. And again, that's anecdotal. How common is that? That's one person's assessment. But to my view, it really does make sense that you have people that should be getting the benefit. They actually are working, but you ask them to fill out a form to get their employer, whatever it is, and they don't do it because they feel that they're doing something wrong, and they end up losing the benefit.
I mean, I agree 100% with what you just said. I'll give you another anecdote that was making the rounds last week because of a terrific story that ran in ProPublica, partnered with a local partner, I think, called The Current. So this is from Georgia, which Georgia, this backstory is a little complicated, but a few years ago, rather than expand Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act, which has been the big source of coverage in so many states, 40 states now have done that, but there's 10 holdout states, mostly in the South. Georgia is one of them. So instead of doing a true expansion where they basically said, look, anybody with income below or just above the poverty line can sign up, they said, no, we're going to do our own version of this, and we're going to have a work requirement. And they set up a procedure, and, right after it started, there was a small business owner. I think it was a small business owner. I should go check that. Don't quote me on this part. But it was somebody who said, this is great. I'm working. I've been trying to get health insurance. Now I can get health insurance through this expansion. I think he was at a press conference with people from the governor's administration. Well, lo and behold, he gets kicked off. Why? Because the forms weren't right. And, this is a guy who seems to know what he's doing, and he jumped through all the hoops and all the boxes, and they kicked him off. So, he appealed, he finally got back on, then he kicked him off again. And finally he's like so frustrated, been through so many administrative hassles. He's just like, he's sort of fed up and gave up on it. Started talking to the press, about what a terrible program this is. Now, of course, he appears in the papers, and suddenly, somebody high up in the state government intervenes, and now he's finally getting his coverage again. But not typical. We have actual data from Georgia. We also have data from Arkansas, which had a work. So just to give you legal background here, for a long time, work requirements were not allowed. During the first Trump administration, a number of states tried to experiment them using, in Medicaid. See, I just did that. In Medicaid, because it's a federal state program, a state can ask to sort of have some of the rules in Medicaid waived if it's got a good reason to do some kind of experiment that they think is consistent with the program's goals. So Arkansas tried to do that with work requirements, got approval from the Trump administration, introduced them, and within a few months they were challenged in court, and actually a federal judge said, no, you can't. It's pretty clear the Medicaid law doesn't allow that. In fact, that's what this bill moving through Congress right now is an attempt to change that law so then states would actually have to do a Medicaid, a work requirement. Well, what's interesting is we have now, because of that, we got a few months of data on how this worked. And overwhelmingly it was clear, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people lost health insurance. And by and large, they were people who had satisfied the rules. They were people who had been working, who had done or had a good reason. But the system was so complicated, they were just so prone to getting caught up in the bureaucracy that they were losing coverage. And in Georgia, it's stunning. The program's been around for 2 years, and I was looking into it. It's been written about it. I've been looking into it as well. And you look at the data, and the number of people who are enrolled in this Georgia program is let's say it's 6,000 or 7,000. And I looked at that number. I said there's got to be a zero missing there, right? Or 2 zeros. I mean, this is a huge state. The eligible population is well into the hundreds of thousands for this expansion. No, 6,000 or 7,000 people. It was so hard to get through the process that only a tiny 3% fraction of the eligible population ever signed up. And there was, and in case you thought it was just, people didn't know about it. No, they did some studies of how many people who started the process made it through the registration all the way. And that was also a very small figure. And that actually starts to make sense when you consider, first of all, well, who is the Medicaid population? There's a lot of these, got a lot of people who maybe don't have the best access to technology. You have a lot of people in things like seasonal jobs where it can be hard to get the doc. You work you got a contract job for a couple months, and now you're off. Well, you need to get evidence that you were working, but you can't find the person who was hiring you. I spoke to someone who was working, who was in between jobs, and they were doing community service, had it documented, and literally 3 times went through the system, filed all the papers. I mean, I saw the forms, and every time it got rejected and they couldn't figure out, and it was one of these things where they couldn't even figure out why it was getting rejected. They didn't understand the system wasn't working. And this just always seems to happen in these circumstances. I mean, there are, as you say, there are people who will try to trick out the system, who don't deserve Medicaid and will try to get it anyway. But as you said, those are the people paying attention. They'll probably figure out their way around the hoops. And the only other thing I'd add to this is, I was watching this morning in the sort of news interviews following last night's vote, and Steve Scalise, what is he in the House leadership?
Whip.
2?
Or leader.
He's
the
majority
leader.
Yeah. I can't. You see, I don't actually cover Congress on a full-time basis, so I'm always like, these are the questions I'm always asking our Capitol. Wait, which position is this person? So Steve Scalise, was saying, if we don't want giving, you don't want to be giving Medicaid to people sitting on their couches, who aren't, who are out to just get a welfare check and be lazy. And I would say 2 things about it. Number one, there's a philosophical question here: should healthcare be something that everybody gets, or do we condition on certain conditions? I mean, that's an important debate to have and worth having. But quite apart from that, they're trying to sort of slot this into the welfare debate, right? And you and I remember this from when Reagan's day, and he was going around saying there's the welfare queens, they're getting the welfare checks and they're spending them on, cars and TVs or whatever. Well, nobody's going out to get no one's out to get on Medicaid so they can get an extra colonoscopy. I mean, what are we thinking here? How's this supposed to work? I mean, it's healthcare.
Yeah,
People aren't
it's
going to be.
pretty odd. I mean, one of
It's
the
pretty
things
odd.
that's striking, and many people have commented on this, of course, that, the Trump administration has been quite explicit that they want to reduce the red tape for corporations. So when it comes to complying with different regulations, whether it's pollution, labor, whatever it might be, they want to reduce the red tape because, it's so onerous, this and that, whatever. You could argue whether it's really the story or not, but they're saying that. And here it is for, people on Medicaid, which again, as you say, these are people, they're less educated in general, better or worse. I mean, it's just the reality. They're not people that are used to dealing with forms. They don't have lawyers at their beck and call. And those are the people that you're throwing all this red tape at. And it is quite striking, at least to me.
That is a really good point. And, it does say something about the sort of priorities. For certain people, we want to make things easier. For certain people, we're going to make them harder. And what's the difference between the two? Well, one's very wealthy, one is, poor, one's well connected, one doesn't have connections. I mean, draw your own conclusions there.
Yeah. Let me ask you, and again, I believe this is still the case. I believe most of these cuts don't actually take place aren't scheduled to take place, I should say, till 2029. So can you tell us a little bit about what the dynamics, what the thinking is there, at least as far as you could tell?
Yeah. So the bill that passed, just to kind of give the sequence of events, what happened here was they've been talking about this forever, well, not forever, but this year we're going to do this, but they were very cagey about whether they were going to cut Medicaid, how much they were going to cut Medicaid. A week ago, finally on a Sunday night, they released the bill. Tuesday morning, they gavel in the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee in the House that has jurisdiction. They do this sort of 26-hour markup session, and then they vote it out. The bill that got out of Energy and Commerce Committee put off most of the Medicaid cuts until 2029, as you say. The reason is the same reason they've been very careful leading up to this about saying what they want to do, and that is they realize Medicaid, in part because of what we were speaking about a minute ago, really does mean a lot to a lot of people. People are going to notice if it goes away. There's a secondary kind of impact, which is the economic impact. Dean, you probably know this. Go to any congressional office and ask them, what is the biggest employer in your district? It's probably a hospital. And hospitals are very much dependent on Medicaid money, especially in rural areas, which, politically tend to be more Republican districts, especially in rural states that have Republican senators. So both in terms of the public at large and their own members, this is a very politically sensitive topic. By putting the cuts off until 2029, well, what's in 2028? Oh, right, a presidential election. You can put it past there. Now, what has been happening just in the last 36 hours, 48 hours, some of the more conservative members have been angry. They feel like the bill does not cut Medicaid enough. Taking health insurance away from 10 million people is not enough. And so they were lobbying leadership. They said, we're not going to vote for this. And in fact, they held it up in the budget committee, which was the next stage of the process. They said, we're going to vote no until these cuts. You do something to sort of make these cuts bolder and stronger. So now what they have apparently done, and I was checking the news just before we got on here, so I'm not sure if this is confirmed or not, but it sounds like one of the changes they made is the work requirements in particular, they have now moved up. And it wasn't clear to me. I saw different reports. Were they going to kick in January 1st of this coming year, so 2026, or January 1st, 2027? So they have tried to move that up. Now, obviously, if you move those sooner, you get bigger budget savings, and that's their argument. They said, look, we want to cut federal spending. It's not about the deficit, although they say that sometimes because this bill, tax cuts are much larger than the spending cuts, so this is going to cause the deficit to go much higher. But they don't like federal spending. They want to cut federal spending. So you move the cut sooner, you move the work requirements sooner. That'll get you more savings. That'll shrink the governments more quickly. But of course, that also accelerates the coverage losses. I would not be surprised if it turns out it's January 1st, 2027, for the same thinking of why you might do it in January 1st, 2029, which is at least January 1st, 2027, puts it after the midterm elections when, all these House members who might be queasy about this have to run for re-election.
Now, let me ask you kind of a nerdy question about the budget scoring on this, that let's say whether it's 227, 229, my understanding is that then gets written into the baseline. So let's, hypothesize. Who knows what the outcome of these elections will be? But let's say you get Democrats or maybe Republicans that say, okay, we really don't want those cuts. Then at that point, that's an increase in the deficit, right? So they would have to say we're increasing the deficit. So they vote to reverse, so you get, people in Congress in 227 or 229, and they say this is a bad idea, we're going to reverse it. So at that point, if you reverse that, since it's been written into the bill, into law, then it would be said you're increasing the deficit, which in fact, you're just going back to where we were. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you change the law, you change the law, right? So if they, putting them, postponing, the good news is if you're a defender of Medicaid and you're trying to think about the future of the program and you want to think, can I undo these? The longer the lead time, when it's postponed, okay, that's more chances to, elect people who would reverse those, or undo some of these changes. But it will be harder. You'll have to come up with the money because now that's the baseline. So, if you want to undo the changes, Congressional Budget Office is going to say, okay, well, now you need to pay for it or count it towards the deficit because that's now part of the current law baseline.
Yeah, I'm not a deficit hawk, so that's not going to bother me, but I know
it's not going to bother you, right?
It'll bother a lot of people in Congress, a lot of people in the media, and so that's a reality they would have to deal with, and so they don't care what I think about deficits. So, okay, well, those are bad stories. Let me take you to a good story that you've had occasion to write on. At least I consider a good story. I think you consider a good story. The Affordable Care Act. Again, we all have lots of complaints about it. We still have a lot of people that don't have access to health care, and a lot of the people that do still end up with bills they can't afford. But I mean, to my view, it was an incredible step forward. You wrote about it, the 10 years were, and again, it was kind of amazing that Obama was able to get it through kind of bare majorities. Although I think I sent you a note about this. I think he actually had more because Pelosi's very good at keeping votes in her pocket. She jokes about how I know how to count votes, and she absolutely does. So it passed officially by one vote. Well, they got a Republican after it already had passed off to flip over and vote for it. But I would be surprised that maybe someone's written about this if she didn't have another 3 or 4 or 5 votes in her pocket. But in any case, it was the barest of majorities, and to my view, it was a great step forward in giving more people coverage. And one of the things that's overlooked, I think, by many people is that it in effect insured coverage. So just to take the simplest case, most of us, thankfully are covered through our work. But if we get seriously ill and we lose our job, well, pre-Obamacare, no one was going to insure you. So, if I do have coverage through my job, I guess I can cover Medicare too. But in any case, if I lost my job because I'd had, I was in an accident or got a serious illness, pre-Obamacare, no one was going to cover someone who, had cancer, had, heart disease. They charge, they either wouldn't cover you at all or have a crazy premium that no one would be able to afford. So to my view, that was a great success story. But again, I'll let you, I don't want to blab. I could go on about this. What's your take on Obamacare? Your I don't know. I was going to say your 30-second element, but no. What do you see as the main pluses and of course minuses? I mean, I don't want it to be a cheerleading.
Yeah. No. Well, first of all, you explained it very well. I thought you did a good job. Yeah, I mean, for people who don't remember, and it's funny, I teach, I'm in Ann Arbor, I'm at the University of Michigan, I teach a class now on the history of healthcare reform, and it's always amazing to me, the students, these very eager, earnest students who are really well informed, and you tell them about what life was like before the Affordable Care Act, and they don't even, it's been enough time now that reality is sort of history, and people who weren't around, or, a lot of people just don't remember what it was like. But it's like you said, you had sort of 2 really big baskets of people who could not get health insurance. You had people who, if you didn't have it through a job, you didn't qualify for Medicare or something like the Veterans Administration, and you're on your own, you're working age. If you had a pre-existing condition, you couldn't get coverage, or the coverage you could get was really lousy. And then on top of that, you had a lot of people who just couldn't afford it. They didn't have the money. Premiums were too expensive. Either whether or not they were trying to buy on their own, or if they worked a low wage job, either the job offered coverage but they couldn't afford the premiums, or if you're working a lot of these service jobs, they don't even offer health insurance. You have this big basket of people, and this has been a reality in American history for a long time. Going back to FDR's time, there had been talk of trying to create a universal healthcare system, and Truman tried to get there, and there was efforts beyond that. Bill Clinton tried to get there. Kept kind of running into a political wall. You're going up against special interests. You're dealing with all the familiar institutional problems of American politics, where the Senate is skewed. You have to get this filibuster and one thing after another. Democrats come along in 2008. They're determined to try to make something happen. The conceit of the law was, look, we don't have the political power to really do what we want to do something, have some kind of Medicare for all system. So we're going to build on what we got here. Try not to, freak people out who already have health insurance, which had always been part of the problem, especially with the Clinton effort. And they got this crazy patchwork where, Medicaid for low-income people, employer insurance for people who have it, and then these new marketplaces, healthcare.gov, if you're familiar with it, where you could get coverage even if you have a pre-existing condition. And if you couldn't afford it, you'd get, a tax credit to subsidize it. And, the coverage, great, big out-of-pocket costs. You might have small networks for your doctors or hospitals. Medicaid, if you're on Medicaid, it can be pretty hard to find a specialist. And healthcare is still hugely expensive in this country for everybody. And if you don't think it's affecting you because you have a job policy, I promise you it is, because your wages would probably be a lot higher if you weren't, you're sort of quietly, invisibly giving some of your wages to health insurance. So, lots of problems, and yet we cut the number of people without health insurance to its lowest level ever right now. And, millions, tens of millions of people have gotten health insurance. And a lot of people have saved money on their premiums. And there's another category, and I know, Dean, you care about this because you always write about this, which is used to be a major impediment to going into part-time work or going and being an entrepreneur on your own, was that it was scary because if you didn't get you had to have work for a large employer to have reliable health insurance. Well, that's not the case anymore. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, because of those protections for pre-existing conditions, because of those subsidies, you can work part-time. And especially if you think about people who say have caregiving needs, you have an elderly relative, you have young kids, you want to start out on your own in a business, that has really opened up new opportunities. And you talk about this all the time. And I always think this is such an underappreciated point of how the Affordable Care Act has helped. So it's by no means perfect. I mean, so far to go to get to the kind of universal system they have, in pretty much every other developed nation, but also so much better than what we had. And, you can see the building blocks for getting to something better in the future. But, first you got to stop to go forward. You don't want to stop going backwards. And that seems to be like the direction we're headed in with this bill.
I had to harangue people in the Obama administration and same with Biden that they wouldn't take credit for it. So, we did some studies that we showed that the number of people voluntarily working part-time increased substantially after the Affordable Care Act went into effect. And we did analysis. Who was it? It was overwhelmingly women with young children, and they were spending time with them. We did you have the time use. There's a special Bureau of Labor Statistics series on time use, and we analyzed that. And yeah, again, not a big surprise. So you'd think again that this would be something to tout, and people could check our work. I'm pretty sure we got it right, but they could do it themselves. You had more parents with young kids spending time with them. I think that would be something most people would say was a good thing, but that they never, for whatever reason, they never chose to tout that. And my guess is very few people are aware of that as being one of the effects. And then also, again, a big increase in self-employment, disproportionately women of color. I mean, again, give people an opportunity. We were joking about that Trump would call Harris and Biden communists. Well, for communists, they create a lot of small businesses, so again, these strike me as good things that you'd think they would like to tout. And, I knew people in the administration, they say, oh, we talk about it. And maybe they did, but, it just was not widely known. So,
Yeah. I mean, there's always been a weird, relationship and sort of, how they want to promote the Affordable Care Act. I mean, there was the period during the Obama administration, second term, and I think they've just felt like they were on the defensive that whole time. And to be fair, Jerry, and you remember this, there were a lot of problems in the early years. There was that big crash of the website when it first rolled out, and healthcare.gov almost, was non-functional for weeks on end. It was about as bad a political embarrassment as you can think of, at least at the time. We've seen worse since, but it was, the world was coming to an end. And then, especially in the early going, there was an adjustment of a term, the insurers trying to figure out the market. A lot of them were like losing money. They left, they came back. There was a lot of anger that, Obama had said everyone was going to save money. And now, intellectually, that was sort of understood to be, I think, by some people as overall our healthcare spending trajectory will slow down, which it did, actually. And so, you'll be saving money relative to what you might have spent if it kept growing. But of course, that doesn't scan. People don't think about, I would have been paying even more for my healthcare if not for this law. And then in addition, you did have sort of pockets of people, significant number, low millions of people who had previously been buying insurance on their own. We were paying a lot less for it anymore because the insurance got better. Now, the old insurance was really crappy, and if they'd gotten sick, they would have a lot of times found out they weren't covered. And, if you got a pre-existing condition, they'd look back at all kinds of problems with it. But a lot of people ended up having to pay more for their insurance. They were understandably quite unhappy. So I think there was a lot of, that plus, they were getting beat up constantly by the Republicans. I think they were afraid to punch back, and maybe they were right. I don't know. I'm not a political strategist.
Yeah.
They did. I do feel like when they tend to rally around it is when it's under attack. The polling on the Affordable Care Act is incredible. It was sort of wobbled between roughly the public split, and then following that's problems with the website, the problems with the market in the first couple of years, which, by the way, not unexpected with a new program that you'd have kind of growing pains, right? I mean, that's the way these things go. It was sort of negative, slightly underwater, as we say in the political business, so slightly more negative opinion than public opinion. And then, bam, it flipped. When did it flip? As soon as Trump got elected in 2016 and started saying, I'm going to take this away. And suddenly everyone was like, wait a minute, take away this stuff. And especially, they were like, and what are you going to do instead? And of course, they had nothing. And then it went way, and so now, ever since then, the majority of Americans support the Affordable Care Act. It doesn't have the, it's not as popular as Medicare, but it's pretty darn popular. So when it's under attack, I think Democrats do a pretty good job of rallying to it. But you're right, they have not really sold it, I think, as sort of on, what you were just talking about, which is such an obvious one for me. Like, it's good for entrepreneurs, it's good for, parents who, and children who have caregiving needs, and just such a no-brainer to me. I mean, I care about those issues a lot too, so I always feel like that's an untapped issue in general, this sort of caregiving agenda as something that I to this day, whatever else Kamala Harris did wrong in her campaign in 2024, I thought her idea to have Medicare picking up long-term care costs was really interesting, and I wish there had been a longer primary and she could have developed it. We could have talked about it, because that was a genuinely innovative program that I know just from the reaction I got when I wrote about it, I think a lot of people would really appreciate. But sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent there.
So just to say a couple more things on Obamacare. I remember Obama said something which proved to be very prescient, that, they came to the term, obviously, Obamacare to ridicule it. He said that, when it passes, people are going to see what it is and they're going to like it, and then they won't call it Obamacare, which is proved to be pretty much on the mark. But again, in terms of, what they did, you mentioned that the cost savings, again, this is nerdy because no one knows what the projections are. Understandably, people have day jobs, but healthcare costs have come in way under projections over the last decade. Now, was that all due to the Affordable Care Act? No, I'm sure not. But I'm sure, 2 points. I'm sure some of it was due to the Affordable Care Act. And then what I've always said is flip it over. Suppose that, costs had come in above projections, for reasons having nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act. Suppose they were coming in above projections in France and Germany and Italy, everywhere. They would blame Obamacare. And, why, the Democrats have not been able to make that point. Again, I understand it's a little nerdy. So, you're telling people projections, whose projections, what, so it's a little hard to do. But I mean, that is the reality. And, we've saved an enormous amount of money if you just envision a counterfactual where costs had continued to rise as they're being projected by, the Congressional Budget Office, the Healthcare Financing Administration, whoever. You could look at private forecasters. They were all showing the same thing. So it really, again, I'm not going to try and say it was all the Affordable Care Act, but clearly it did play a role. And, that's a really great story. So I've kept you a long time, and I know you got to run back in your reporting on this, but let me just ask you, in your last however minute, 2 minutes, whatever, where do you think this is going to go? Are the Republicans going to be able to get it through? I'm asking you to be a political prognosticator.
Yeah.
Here, but,
and I'm a terrible political prognosticator. I would say this. One thing I think you can count on Republicans to do is pass tax cuts. Right? I mean, they always do. Whatever else, what did they get done last time Trump was president? They didn't get anything done legislatively except the tax cuts. What that's what they do. That's in their DNA. Like, what is the most, there's the Democrats and Republicans, they have their thing they really, really care about and they're going to try to do. Democrats, it's frequently, trying to expand the welfare state, trying to provide for people. Republicans, it's cutting taxes. So I think they're going to pass a tax cut bill. I think the question is, how much do they decide they need to pay for it? I mean, they're already not paying for it, whether or not that matters, whatever, but they're already not paying for it. But they say they need to offset some of it. I think, Paul Krugman was writing the other day and sort of made the point that, maybe this isn't because they want to offset it. Maybe it's just because they just don't like the programs and just don't, and you can, again, interpret that for whatever reason you want. So I think, it's hard to say. I think some Medicaid cuts probably go through. I think work requirements, they have tried very hard to sell that as, we're just getting rid of the lazy people. We're protecting healthcare for the vulnerable. I don't know how well that sells. I think the polling on this shows that this is already pretty unpopular. I don't think a lot of people believe the Republicans when they say this is not going to hurt. I think this comes down to how much pain are they willing to bear politically? And that I just don't know. I just don't know. The wild card here is Trump. I think if Trump tells them to pass it, they'll pass it. They'll pass it like it looks now. And if 10 million people are going to lose health insurance, then, he's okay with that. Interestingly, throughout this debate, Trump has been cautious. He said, we don't want to cut Medicaid. We want to protect the vulnerable. And that's his political antenna for the fact that we haven't talked about this, but a little bit we talked about this, rural districts, Medicaid being so important. When you think about the extent to which it pays for, it pays for 40% of all live births in America. It's the single biggest, financier of substance abuse disorder treatment. And you think about states that really, places like West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, those are some pretty red states. And a lot of MAGA voters there. So I don't know. I think that's the thing to watch. Where is Trump on this? And obviously, as we all know with Trump, what he says today could change what he, could change. He could say something totally different by tomorrow. I don't think he really cares about any of this substantively. But I suspect at the end of the day, his political radar for self and his instinct for self-preservation, to the extent he cares about it politically, is what's going to decide this. How's that for a wishy-washy answer?
Well, thanks a lot for joining us, and I'll let you get back to figuring out what's going on with the legislation at this point. And so let's hope. I don't know what we should hope for at this point. Let's hope they don't throw too many people, take away healthcare from too many people. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.